An American freight locomotive sits idling in a rail yard at 2 a.m., burning fuel with no one aboard. Across the Atlantic, a European locomotive was shut down hours ago. Same machine, same purpose, completely different logic. The reason why reveals a hidden divide in how these two continents built their rail networks. Union Pacific reported burning 3.5 million gallons of diesel fuel in idle mode across its network in 2022. That is not a rounding error. It is nearly 4% of the company's total fuel use, and it happens every year. On a single locomotive, idling for one night, say an 18-hour stretch between assignments, can consume about 72 gallons of diesel. Multiply that by a 4-engine consist and the number jumps to nearly 300 gallons just to keep the engines warm and ready. The cost is both staggering and routine. At 3 to 4 gallons per hour per locomotive, the fuel bill adds up quickly, but so does the wear on the machinery. The logic behind the practice is rooted in the mechanics of the engine itself. When a locomotive is shut down and left to cool, the metal of the engine block and the cylinder liners contract at different rates. On restart, the sudden rush of heat and pressure can cause micro-cracking at the liner block interface, a failure mode that is both subtle and expensive. Field manuals for the EMD710, a common prime mover, warn about this risk and recommend maintaining a uniform oil film before ignition. The threat is not just theoretical. Shop records and OEM studies have documented that cold starts accelerate liner and bearing wear. In some cases, up to 45% of piston ring replacements and nearly a third of turbocharger bearing rebuilds are linked to cold start stress over a 5-year window. The risk is highest in cold climates, where oil viscosity spikes and fuel can gel, but even in milder conditions, the first minutes after a cold start are the most punishing for engine components. So the choice to idle is not simply a matter of habit or waste. It is a calculated trade-off. Burn fuel now to avoid a much bigger maintenance bill later. For railroads like Union Pacific, the math is done at scale. The millions of gallons burned in idle are weighed against the cost of premature engine failure, unscheduled repairs, and lost network reliability. That calculation, balancing fuel expense with the hidden cost of mechanical stress, has shaped the American approach to locomotive operation for decades. Oil inside a locomotive engine behaves differently as temperatures drop. For every 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature falls. Oil film thickness drops by about 15%. That shrinking film means metal-on-metal contact is more likely. Especially during the first seconds after a cold start, mechanics who have torn down EMD 710 engines and GEVO engines can point to the scoring on cylinder liners and the pitting on turbo bearings. That damage often traces back to the moment an engine is restarted after cooling down overnight. Turbochargers rely on a steady flow of warm, thin oil and are especially vulnerable. When an engine has been shut down for hours in sub-freezing weather, the oil thickens and turbocharger bearings lose their protective cushion. On startup, the turbo lags behind, spinning up slower than normal as cold oil struggles to circulate. That lag forces the engine to run rich, burning more fuel and putting extra stress on the combustion chamber. Field data shows that for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit drop below operating temperature, bearing fatigue life can fall by 30%. After a harsh winter, shop logs often show a spike in turbo rebuilds and bearing replacements. Fuel is not immune to the cold either. Standard diesel begins to gel at around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, forming wax crystals that clog injectors and filters. Additives can lower the cloud point, but at a cost, and they do not fully eliminate the risk. If fuel gels overnight, a locomotive might refuse to start at all, or run rough until the system warms up. Mechanics in the Dakotas and Minnesota have stories of engines stranded at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, where even a brief shutdown can turn into an expensive rescue operation. The environment amplifies these risks. In the United States, railroads face not only sub-zero winters in North Dakota, but also desert days that swing from 110 degrees Fahrenheit to a chilly 30 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Rapid temperature swings punish engine components. Studies show that shutting down after a hot day and restarting in the cold can increase wear rates by 12%, compounding the damage from oil and fuel thickening. European railroads operating in milder climates simply do not face the same extremes. Their oil and fuel stay within safer temperature ranges, and their engines can be shut down with far less risk. In the American context, idling becomes a form of insurance, a way to keep oil circulating, fuel liquid, and turbochargers protected against the next cold start. For engineers and mechanics, the numbers are clear. The cost of idling is weighed against the measurable, often hidden, price of mechanical wear in a climate that rarely cuts anyone a break. At a European marshalling yard, the end of a locomotive's shift looks nothing like the nightly ritual in most American yards. Here, the crew brings the engine to a stop beside a row of sturdy metal pedestals, each fitted with a thick, color-coded cable and a weatherproof connector. Instead of keeping the diesel engine running, a worker steps down and plugs the locomotive into a 400-volt, three-phase shore power supply, the European standard for railway auxiliary power. This connection, rated for up to 250 kilowatts, delivers enough electricity to run all the essential systems, coolant pumps, oil heaters, battery chargers, and even cab climate control. With a twist of the connector, the locomotive's onboard computer senses the external power and safely shuts down the diesel prime mover. Preheater units drawing from the grid circulate warm coolant and oil through the engine block, keeping temperatures stable through the night. There is no need for a noisy auxiliary generator or a diesel-powered preheater cart. The process takes just a few minutes, and once complete, the locomotive sits quietly. No exhaust, no vibration, no fuel consumption. This workflow is routine across yards in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, where shore power pedestals are spaced every 25 meters along the tracks. The infrastructure is built into the yard's design, with high-capacity substations feeding both the locomotive connectors and the adjacent logistics terminals. For the crew, shutting down is just part of the job. The engine will be ready to start on demand, fully warmed and charged, by the time the next assignment rolls around. In this environment, leaving a diesel idling overnight would seem as unnecessary as leaving a car running in a garage. The contrast with American practice is stark, not just in the silence, but in the absence of wasted fuel and wear. Installing shore power in an American rail yard is not as simple as dropping in a few outlets. The costs are steep and the logistics daunting. Each pedestal, essentially a heavy-duty electrical plug for locomotives, runs between $180,000 and $250,000, depending on the transformer size and control equipment. Multiply that by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, of parking spots in a major classification yard, and the total quickly climbs into the tens of millions. But the expense does not stop at the pedestal. The real challenge lies beneath the surface, trenching for high-capacity cables, pouring new conduit, and upgrading substations that were never designed to handle megawatt-class loads. A typical retrofit at a place like Barstow or Bailey Yard requires not just new hardware, but months of engineering studies, environmental permits, and union safety reviews. On average, the permitting and construction process drags out for 18 to 24 months, with the yard forced to operate around open trenches and staged shutdowns. During that time, throughput drops and labor costs rise as crews navigate detours and temporary power outages. For infrastructure planners, these numbers are not just line items, they are reasons to hesitate. The capital outlay for shore power can dwarf the annual fuel bill for idling, especially when the yard's physical sprawl means longer cable runs and more complex logistics. The result is a kind of inertia. Even as the technology to shut down locomotives exists, the sheer scale and cost of retrofitting legacy yards has kept most American railroads firmly in the idling camp. The economic calculus is not just about fuel or maintenance, it is about whether the upfront investment can ever pay off in a system built for diesel, not for plugs and cables. When diesel locomotives swept across America in the 1950s, the country made a defining choice. Instead of wiring its vast rail network for electric power, the United States doubled down on diesel as the backbone of freight movement. The logic was simple. With more than 140,000 miles of track crossing deserts, mountains, and prairies, the cost of electrification seemed out of reach. As a result, American yards were built around fueling tracks and maintenance spurs, not high-voltage lines or plug-in pedestals. Diesel was king, and the culture that grew up around it prized engines that could run anywhere, anytime, no matter the weather. Europe took a different path. Beginning in the 1960s, countries like Germany and France poured public money into electrifying their main rail corridors. By the 1990s, more than half of Western Europe's rail mileage ran under wire. For the yards and depots that still needed diesel, governments offered incentives to install shore power, 400-volt three-phase pedestals that allowed locomotives to shut down while staying warm and charged. The European Union's Green Yard funding, part of a broader push to cut emissions, covered much of the retrofit cost. In places like Mashon Yard, shore power became standard, and shutting down at the end of a shift was just the routine. Electrification made shutdowns practical. Regulation has reinforced these differences. In the United States, federal rules focus on emissions from running engines, not idling ones. State-level efforts, like California's draft idle cap, have met stiff resistance. When the California Air Resources Board proposed a 30-minute idle limit, the Association of American Railroads and industry coalitions pushed back hard, citing studies that cold starts could cost the state's freight fleet $5 million a year in extra maintenance. Lobbyists argued that without shore power and preheaters, strict limits would do more harm than good. Meanwhile, European operators faced not only emissions caps but also noise restrictions and direct financial incentives to adopt shutdown-friendly infrastructure. Over decades, these policy choices widened the gap between the two continents, turning locomotive idling from a technical quirk into a story about how infrastructure, regulation, and history shape the daily rhythm of railroading. At the heart of every idling decision is a spreadsheet, one that pits fuel cost against the price of cold start wear. For decades, the break-even figure for American railroads has hovered around $2.75 per gallon. If diesel stays below that, idling wins on paper, but that math is starting to shift as new technology enters the yards. Automatic Engine Stop-Start Systems, AESS, have rolled out on select fleets using sensors and algorithms to shut down a locomotive when it is safe and restart it only when needed. In a Barstow pilot by BNSF, AESS delivered a 65% cut in overnight fuel burn, without a spike in maintenance costs over 6 months. That is not just a blip. Maintenance logs showed no measurable increase in turbo or bearing failures, even with hundreds of automated starts. Auxiliary Power Units, APUS, offer another path. These small diesel generators keep the cab warm and the batteries charged while the main engine sleeps. Field data shows a 30% drop in idle fuel use on units equipped with APUS, though the savings are offset slightly by fuel used by the APUS. Battery hybrid retrofits push even further, with trials of Wabtec's FLX drive showing zero idle fuel consumption during yard stays. But at a steep upfront cost, about $2 million per locomotive. For tech vendors, these numbers are proof that the old trade-offs are not set in stone. Yet for every promising pilot, There is a spreadsheet showing long payback periods or cultural resistance in the shop. The break-even line keeps moving, but the pathway to widespread adoption remains tangled in economics, legacy infrastructure, and the habits of a workforce trained to trust a running engine. Inside the cab of a freight locomotive, the logic of idling is not just written in technical manuals. It is lived experience for the crews who run these trains through the night. When asked about shutting down engines between shifts, most American engineers and shop mechanics do not hesitate. In a national survey, 62% said they preferred to keep locomotives running, even when new technology could make shutdowns safer. The reasons go beyond habit. For crews, a running engine means heat, working air brakes, and a cab that is ready for anything the railroad throws at them. Union leaders have built their safety arguments around these realities. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen points to incidents where a failed cold start left crews stranded miles from help, sometimes in sub-zero weather. Their position is clear. A locomotive that will not start is more than a maintenance headache. It is a safety risk for our people. In winter, the fear is not just about mechanical wear. It is about the possibility of being stuck in remote territory with no power for heaters or radios. Stories circulate among crews about engines that froze solid overnight, or trains that lost air pressure and could not move until a rescue arrived. This collective memory shapes the culture in American yards. Veteran engineers teach new hires to trust a running engine over a promise from a computer or a new gadget. Even as automatic stop-start systems and shore power begin to show up, skepticism runs deep. For many, the risk of a cold, stranded locomotive outweighs the promise of fuel savings or cleaner air. The result is a workforce that sees idling not as waste but as a line of defense, a practical safeguard in a job where the unexpected is always one call away. Every decision about locomotive idling is shaped by a deeper philosophy, one that goes far beyond engines and fuel. In Europe, the rail network is designed around efficiency and central coordination. Power, maintenance, and scheduling are managed as tightly integrated systems, with infrastructure built to support collective goals. This approach favors investments in shore power, electrified yards, and automated shutdown routines, all aimed at minimizing waste and maximizing network-wide performance. The American model grew from different roots. Here, independence and flexibility are prized. Railroads stretch across vast distances, often far from centralized utilities or dense population centers. Yards were built to keep trains ready for anything. A sudden weather swing, a last-minute crew change, or an unexpected surge in freight. The system rewards flexibility, even if it means burning extra fuel to keep engines running and crews confident that power is always available. This contrast is not just about technology or climate. It reflects how each continent views infrastructure itself. Europe invests in centralized systems that enable efficiency at scale. The United States favors distributed solutions that protect against disruption and prioritize reliability, even at the cost of higher fuel use. Locomotive idling, then, becomes a symbol of these competing philosophies, one prioritizing collective optimization, the other valuing autonomy and resilience. Timelines for change are now written into company roadmaps and government pilot programs, but the numbers behind them are anything but settled. The Environmental Protection Agency Rail Yard Electrification Initiative sets a target of shore power at 10 major U.S. yards within 3 years, but that covers only a sliver of the network. Meanwhile, auxiliary power unit retrofits are projected to reach about 20% of the fleet by 2028, and battery-assisted locomotives are forecast to make up 5% by 2032. These figures sound promising, but they rest on voluntary commitments and soft targets. There is no binding mandate, no guaranteed funding, and no penalty for missing the mark. Against this backdrop, the cost of inaction keeps climbing. The Congressional Research Service pegs annual diesel consumption from idling at nearly $9 billion, with another $2 to $3 billion lost to accelerated wear and emissions penalties. Every year that passes without large-scale adoption of shutdown technology, another mountain of fuel is burned for the sake of reliability, habit, or lack of infrastructure. The roadmap is clear in theory: shore power at key yards, auxiliary power units on a fifth of the fleet, battery hybrids where feasible, but the gap between plan and progress remains wide. The unanswered question now hangs over the industry. How many more billions in fuel and maintenance will be accepted as the price of inertia? Today, American railroads and their European counterparts each defend their logic with data. One prioritizing reliability in vast, rugged climates, the other leveraging centralized infrastructure for efficiency. Neither side holds the only answer. As U.S. locomotives burn an estimated 250 million gallons of fuel while idling each year, the question lingers: how much longer will the divide persist before innovation, or necessity, tips the balance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.